So I'm very excited to be able to introduce Rebecca Sachs to you if you don't already know her, but many of you already do. She is the author of this beautiful book, City of a Thousand Gates, and she is an MFA alum from UCI's amazing programs in writing. She received her MFA in fiction in 2019. And I have had the pleasure of sharing many meals and holidays with her, as well as also sharing her book with her while it was being written and being able to be part of that creative journey that she will now be sharing with you tonight. So what is City of a Thousand Gates? It's a multifaceted portrait of contemporary Jerusalem. It's told through a range of compelling characters. They include a Shomer Shabbos soccer player, a Palestinian literature professor, an American Jew with liberal sensibilities and her mainstream Israeli husband, a young German journalist with a sex problem, a frum mother and her baby-faced Army reservist son, a Palestinian college student who has traveled to Norway and fallen in love with a man, his Palestinian friend who blocks off this knowledge with his own fantasies of romance, an Israeli girl who monitors a surveillance screen for the army. Very, very disparate portrait of Jerusalem, and what holds these people together is the way each of them processes an event that has occurred just before the novel starts. A Palestinian boy has been beaten by Jewish Israeli youth in a shopping mall. And he languishes in Augusta Victoria Hospital, where journalists, family members, and the Israeli police are on a death watch, anticipating riots and preparing to mourn. It sounds uncannily familiar. Sachs handles the violence at the heart of the novel with tenderness and honesty. We are spared nothing, but we are also forced to linger not on the deed itself, but rather on the way that the guilt, rage, resentment, fear, and fascination triggered by the crime bleeds into the lives of these residents of Jerusalem. Rebecca is interested in juxtapositions, even within couples and families, and certainly across the city and its surrounding settlements and towns. And these contrasts force us to compare, adjudicate, imagine. We're never left safe in one perspective, but we're instead continually yanked to consider how violence resonates in a city built on conflicting claims to possession and belonging. Much of the action takes place around Easter Passover. And a standout moment for me, and I had permission from Rebecca to share this with you, it's not a spoiler alert. A standout moment for me is when Vera, who's the German journalist, interviews the Palestinian professor. And Vera is not a deep person, yet she is able to channel some of the insights shared with her into a new understanding of the boy's body as participating in the mystery of Easter. She understands that the Israelis are likely to confiscate the body to keep it from becoming the icon of riot and revolt. And the boy's family and community, meanwhile, are waiting to steal the body from the hospital as soon as he dies. And Vera records on her phone the effort to spirit the body through the back of the hospital and over a wall, where the fresh corpse bleeds from post-mortem wounds, in an eerie replay of his mob assault in that shopping mall. Now, Vera has been preparing a set of metaphors for her German Gentile readers back home, and now suddenly those metaphors are before her in their naked, lived reality. Rebecca, too, has been preparing us, indulging our weaknesses for symbolism in order to suddenly serve the empty tomb of a disappeared corpse up to us, shorn of all poeticism. It is a shocking, brilliant sequence in which Rebecca's mastery of her craft and her honesty as a storyteller converge in a flash that will never leave me. this novel is built out of hundreds of such moments, each one a kind of prism that projects the pathos of one person's experience against all the other experiences that she willfully excludes or misunderstands. How to meld compassion and irony, read and wonder. So it's great pleasure that I now bring onto stage Rebecca Sachs herself. And there she is. And we're just so excited to get to hear you talk about the genesis of this book and share some passages with us. And if people have questions or comments, we will try to answer a few of those. So please pose those in the Q&A box.
Julia, I've never been introduced like that before. That was exquisite. Thank you. Wow, every novelist should have the honor of being read by Julia Lupton. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for coming back and sharing with us.
Wow.
Tonight, we're really very excited.
Well, I'll jump in then. So as you mentioned, I'm going to read from a few different selections rather than one specific chapter. And indeed, I'm going to start with Vera, not the chapter that you so beautifully crystallized, but an earlier chapter. So I don't think I need to tell you much about Vera now, as I think, but a refresher, German journalist, has early 20s, has come to Israel to sort of make her name in what she hopes to be writing, which is literary journalism. But for now, and when we find her, she is off to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, not to write about what she wants to be writing about. She wants to be writing about this horrible mob beating that Julia mentioned, and in general, what she would call the tit for tat for violence that's sort of playing out throughout this novel. But instead, she is going to write a hotel review, which she has been paid to do by an in-flight magazine, and that is how she makes her living right now. So she's not telling the story she wants to be telling, and that's where we find her on the bus from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to write this story. The air in the bus is stuffy for the first half hour of the journey, but it cools the closer they get to Jerusalem. Non-native pine trees line the highways, planted by refugee Zionists in the last century. Elsewhere, the ghosts of Palestinian villages. The Israeli that Vera is currently fucking, this absolutely ripped footballer with horrible tattoos, told her that in Hebrew, one literally ascends to Jerusalem, a reflection both of the city's hilly location and its holiness. As if people didn't throw garbage onto the streets of Jerusalem, didn't let their toddlers squat and shit on the sidewalk. The entire place has an oppressive and, she'd never use this word aloud, but she thinks it, primitive air. Every woman's body angrily obscured by various orthodoxies. No wonder all the secular Israelis end up in Berlin. Long before she came to Israel to try her hand at journalism, she'd met more Israelis than she could count. She'd snorted coke with them at 4 a.m. clubs, sat in their chilly Grefekitz flats, drinking instant coffee. She understands why they come to Berlin, to rid themselves of some weight, to escape the demands of their ideology into a city that purports to be allergic to any national ideology. The question is, why did she decide to come to their country, armed only with a few press contacts and a conversational ability in Arabic? What does she want? When anybody asks her, she tells them she wants to write stories that matter. It sounds true, or at least plausible. The taxi van winds up and around until they crest into the city. A wooden sign by the side of the highway. Welcome to Jerusalem. Welcome to Jerusalem, city of graves. The hills on the city tower above them, covered in graves like broken teeth. Orthodox Jewish men Daven and tremble among the markers, their black coats in the early noonday sun, flapping like crows. So Vera, this character Vera, and I'll read a little more from her chapter in a moment. She emerged to me, interestingly, as an ancillary character in someone else's chapter. She didn't have a name. She was just the German girl, the German tourist, and this was in a chapter that ended up in the book, in which she's picked up by a couple as a hitchhiker. And for most of the chapter, she's really almost like not peripheral, but almost spectral. She sort of represents very different anxieties, both to the husband and to the wife. And it was really only at the end of that chapter, which is called Strangers, at the end of writing it for the first time, that this German tourist, or who they had thought of as a tourist, began to emerge as someone more complex and troubling than the person either person had imagined. And I became curious about her. I wanted to learn more about her, and I liked how she kind of stormed the chapter, as it were. But I didn't even know her name, so I began to write to find out. But that happens to me not infrequently, that curiosity will lead me to follow a character who wanders into someone else's story. So I'm going to jump back into this chapter, where we will find Vera at the hotel that she is writing about for an in-flight magazine, which is a gig I myself have had to pay the bills. All right. Vera shifts her weight from foot to foot. She is on a private terrace, perk of this particular class of hotel suite. An Israeli PR woman in a pencil skirt and sensible flats talks to her about the thread count, of the sheets on the bed inside. She writes down the number 500 in her notebook. She looks out over the sun-drenched city. White stone, new construction. On the sidewalk below, women with their hair covered pull market baskets on wheels. An Israeli soldier, red boots, green uniform, leaves a convenience store, his rifle swung casually over his shoulder. Two priests pass in front of him, kicking up their robes as they ascend the steep hill toward the old city. The hotel, a prominent stone building erected under the Ottomans, is angled with its back, as it were, toward the old city, instead facing West Jerusalem. Everything that happens in Jerusalem happens to the east, which is, technically, where the West Bank begins. Somewhere out there, ideology is unfolding in violent, consequential ways. The Israeli settlements continue their steady takeover of Area C. A monstrous 8-meter-high wall snakes around the city of Jerusalem, with entrances monitored carefully by a series of checkpoints. And in a hospital, high above the city, is the body of a 14-year-old hooked up to wires and tubes, alive, but barely. So the 14-year-old she's referencing here is Salem Abu Khdir, who again was the day before this story occurs, horribly beat and is in a coma in this East Jerusalem hospital, and his attack was a revenge attack for an Israeli girl the same age who was killed in her West Bank settlement home. And of course, that very much is what Vera wants to be writing about, not this luxury hotel. Do you have any questions? The woman asks, the PR woman asks, as they walk back into the hotel room. The hotel bed is huge, pristine. Vera, for a moment, thinks of the weight of her Israeli lover on top of her, the way he collapses when he orgasms, almost convulsing into the back of her neck. No matter how loud he groans, she always needs to be louder, Always it's the sound of her own pleasure that makes her come. Because of course she knows what she is doing here. She came to take note of how plastic bags shudder and shred on all the ubiquitous barbed wire. She came to conduct interviews in stuffy rooms where mothers weep for their sacrificed sons. She came to cross checkpoints, armed by teenage soldiers, baby-faced and lethal. She came to watch the beast of this place choke on its own tail. She came to write about it, to narrate it, to publish article after article until her voice, Vera's voice, becomes a kind of soundtrack that brings poignancy, maybe even beauty, to the most divisive conflict in the whole world. And yet, here's Vera, listening to a woman with a top knot talk about the unconventional light switches in this hotel that costs over 400 euros a night, more than she will get paid for the review she writes for an in-flight magazine. Please excuse me, Vera says, stuffing her notebook into her leather backpack. I must leave. But the tour, the woman in flat says, her eyebrows contorting in alarm. You haven't seen the spa yet. Send photos, Vera cries over her shoulder as she rushes out of the room and down the hallways of identical doors. She is through the marble lobby and then she is out. She is going east. And I'm going to skip ahead a little in this chapter, spare you some of the logistics, but Vera makes it to Augusta, gets on the correct bus, which brings her to Augusta Victoria Hospital, a place I went to frequently when I was writing, not just this chapter, but the others that unfold there. And not unlike Vera will do, wandered around, vaguely predatory, looking for a story. The bus drops her near Augusta Victoria Hospital. She's read about it, but never been here. It's often described as an oasis of Europe in East Jerusalem, looking more like a cathedral than a hospital. Its most famous feature is the stately bell tower, a grand witness to the entire city below it. The grounds are quiet. Families eat picnics on benches. All the women in hijabs. All the men sit spread across benches. Vera has read how families from the West Bank, from Gaza even, bring their children here for treatment, although only if the Israelis give them permission. Somewhere in this hospital is the body of Salam Abu Khdir, a boy who is neither alive nor dead. She picks at her cuticles, a bad habit she can't quite shake. She has no plan now that she's arrived at the hospital. Surely she can't go inside and run around looking for the dying boy. But she wants to be here. She wants to be where it is happening, whatever it is. She walks among the picnicking families, the frail and unwell children. She walks toward the hospital, olive trees and white stone. The grand architecture makes a promise, something about order and decency, something about God and empire. It is the kind of promise that white people, her people, truly believed 100 years ago. She looks up at the windows, all of them shapely, like a woman's upper lip. Where are you? Vera thinks. Where am I? Interesting fact about the bell tower of Augusta Victoria Hospital. It was for the sake of transporting that bell tower from the port town of city of Jaffa that the road from Jaffa to Jerusalem was paved. There. All right, so I'm going to jump to another point of view, a new chapter.
And Rebecca?
Yes.
And would you mind giving the page number? Some people are following along. Is that?
Oh, wow, how very diligent. All right, yes, certainly. Okay, a real university crowd. Absolutely, I will give the page number. I'm going to jump to the chapter A Good Arab, which opens on page 70. For those of you following, I modify slightly for the sake of readings. So It'll be more exciting for you that way, I suppose. And I'm the chapter I'm jumping to is a character named Shibi Hassan. And this is our first time in his point of view. So previously, the way this character emerged was through the kind of obsessive gaze of one of his teammates. Shibi is a professional soccer player in the Israeli Premier League. He is a East Jerusalem Palestinian, which is a very bureaucratically complex identity, the complex identity in many ways, but the bureaucracy of it is quite idiosyncratic and factors in to his story, although not to what I'm not directly to what I'm going to be reading today, but it is important to know that he's a Palestinian from East Jerusalem who has chosen to play on an Israeli soccer team and moved his family to a Jewish area of West Jerusalem. And previously, when we met this character, like I said, it was through the kind of obsessive gaze of one of his teammates, actually the Shomer Shabbat soccer player that Julia referenced in the introduction, is a little obsessed with Shibi, who is really the star of the soccer team he's on. He's the midfielder, the number 10, and is finding success on this soccer team. And yes, and again, I'm on page 70. They fought again last night. Why wouldn't they? Night after night. Invariably, Shibi says something that annoys his wife. It was just the two of them. Mellon-Sawyer had gone down easily, and Shibi thought that maybe he and Amal might watch a movie, a TV show, really anything but the news, which was showing the same horrifying photo of Salem Abu Khdir in his hospital bed, face swollen and bloodied. All of this on the 77-inch screen, ultra high definition, that they have mounted up on the wall in a setup so involved, it's not called a TV, but a home theater. Amal was leaning toward the television from the couch. You want me to change it? He asked. She turned to him, but didn't respond. Her eyes glazed over, as if she saw Shibi perfectly and was disappointed, but not surprised. When did he come to expect this look? When did it start making him so angry? Instead of responding as he once might have, perhaps with gentle teasing, he found his voice rising, so satisfying that it was like scratching a bug bite. Are you deaf? He cried. From there, it all went downhill. Night after night, it goes like this. Is this how it's supposed to be? A marriage? He doesn't know how to formulate this concern into a question he could actually ask anyone. Some days, Shibi rises as soon as he wakes to mix his breakfast shake in their splendid marble kitchen. But today he remains in bed with his sleeping wife and tries to understand where he is, where they are. Her back is toward him. Her breath is even. Their sheets are soft and cool. Their duvet is stuffed with real goose feathers. All of this bought at some Israeli store that imports everything from Europe. He shifts to his side, facing her, facing away from him. It is stupid, he knows, to compare his life now to when they were young. They are a family now, a real family with a baby, Nasir. Before, they were just two people in love, so young, newlyweds in his parents' home, left to themselves. A half day when he wasn't training became a universe, the soft creases of her elbows, her little sighs. Time, they wallowed in time. All morning they lay in an unmade bed that sopped up rich sunlight. They were sleepy with pleasure. That's how Nasir was conceived, in a state of sustained, blissful exhaustion. Where are those beautifully squandered hours now? Now, when he reaches for her, it is across dark water. Amal, he thinks, let's start again. Her hair is dark and mussed across the pillow. He thinks of last night, she in tears and he with his head in his hands, pacing the room, Nasir awake and clinging to her, sobbing. He tries to remember the last time they went 3 days in a row without fighting. When did this become the routine? He thinks it may have changed when he moved her to the Jewish part of the city. He can't let himself say, that was a mistake, but he does admit that, yes, there were trade-offs he hadn't foreseen. He didn't know she would be choked like a flower by weeds in the Jewish neighborhood. Is that how it started? With her isolation? They are close to home, just a short drive across the light rail tracks to his parents, to her parents, and yet it is also true that now Shibi and his wife live in a different world. That was part of the appeal. Not the distance from their families, but the luxuries of living in a place as expensive and well-tended as this. The neighborhood actually gets garbage collection, has reliable drinking water, parks. But maybe he didn't consider the costs to his wife and their baby boy to spend so much time in the Jews' world. He wonders if part of him wanted to feel less lonely here in their world, in their football arenas, on their talk shows, on their cereal boxes. Shibi has recently been given the honor of being put on a cereal box as the star of his soccer team, on their cereal boxes. So he brought Amal and Nasir over to this side, and now they are all paying for it. At first, it had been funny, almost hilarious, to live in the snobby West Jerusalem complex. Every few months, the lobby was decorated for a different Jewish holiday. Little flags celebrating the capture of Jerusalem, the founding of their state. None of it seemed real. Even greeting their neighbors in friendly Hebrew was a kind of farce. His wife had laughed too. It was a joke they were both in on. But when the joke wore off, this was still their life. Waking up in an apartment complex filled with strangers, no neighbor to come over and help her hollow out zucchini, nobody to really talk to. And if she is on the phone in the hallway speaking Arabic, the long looks, nobody says anything. Not the young family who moved from France, father is big in shipping. Not the elderly couple whose high-tech son bought them their condo. Nobody says anything, but nobody has to say anything. Last night, Amal said, not for the first time, I can feel them watching me. Her hand gripped her chest, purple-red manicured fingernails, stacks of gold rings, eyeliner smudged. I can feel them watching us. She was terrifying, Shibi thought in that moment, his own worst fears alive in this woman. Now that Nasir has become chatty, it is definitely worse. Yet another thing that Shibi failed to anticipate. How much Hebrew his son will have to speak, day in and day out, even if he goes to a diplomat school where they learn mostly in English and Arabic, a bit of German, and minimal Hebrew. There are questions they have not discussed and that Shibi does not know the answers to. Should they speak to Nasir in Hebrew when they are in public, when they are in the hallways of their own apartment building? Will he be safe? Will he be safer? They are rich, so they are supposed to be safe, but they worry. They worry. How many were watching when Salem was beaten? For over 5 minutes, they beat him. But last night, when Amal listed these horrible facts, Salem in a coma, the way everyone watched him being beaten, Nasir speaking Arabic, how scared she is for him, Shibi found himself carried off in a wave of frustration, maybe even rage. Halas, it's nonsense, he cried, throwing her hand off his arm. He has had those very same thoughts, but he could not bear to hear her echo his fears. He could not bear the accusation of it. How can we choose to live among them when they want to erase us? He said, I am doing the best I can. Don't they have 2 cars? Won't his son go to a private school with the children of diplomats? Shibi is the starting number 10 on a team that has a solid chance at winning the league this year. He is in his mid-20s and has, inshallah, a long career ahead of him. He is giving her a beautiful life. He yelled it. I'm doing the best I can. and then almost immediately caught himself, lest the neighbors hear words they didn't understand and call the cops. Angry Arabic. Amal saw it. She saw the moment of Shibi holding himself back, of Shibi anticipating their Jewish neighbor's response and silencing himself. She saw it and she laughed. "What are we doing?" she said. So Shivi's situation of and the decision he's made of where to bring his family came to me where I think a lot of things come to me, which is talking to a stranger on a bus. And I was on a bus from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, and I got into a conversation with the man sitting next to me. And we had both recently been visiting, although we didn't overlap there, a refugee camp called Shaufat, which is in Jerusalem, and also figures into the book ultimately. But and I asked, oh, and like, are you living there now? And he said, no, my mother and I moved to Pisgat Zev, which is a Jewish settlement in East Jerusalem. And there's all different reasons. A Jewish Israeli might live there. Some of them might be financial, but some might see it as ideological. And I was a little surprised to hear this Palestinian man from a refugee camp in Jerusalem had chosen to live in this Jewish Israeli area. And I immediately was wondering if there was something ideological in it, or that's where my mind went. So as sort of tentatively or gently as I could, ask, oh, and what led you to, to make that move? And he said, I'm sure the answer is more complex, but he said to me, the water pressure. The water pressure is better, which was sort of like a good reminder to me in general that the material concerns of people's lives, like, is sort of so always shaped and interacting with like the ideology. And that was years before I wrote this chapter, or even before I was writing the novel in any meaningful way, but it must have stuck with me. Also, I suppose I should say the Said Kashua television program, Avoda Aravit, touches upon on those themes a lot too. Okay, so for this final section I'm going to read, I'm going to jump into a different point of view. And here we are going to be with Ori, the 19-year-old Israeli soldier. I'm going to be reading from Fauda, and I'm going to start on 189 of Fauda. So what you need to know at this point in the story, in the novel that is, we've met Ori a few times. By the time we get here, we know that he is very, he's a real pretty boy, which is something that his unit mates give him a little shit for. He's a beautiful kid, and they kind of make fun of him for it. And aside from that, he's in a combat unit. He serves in different bases in the West Bank, and his family lives in the West Bank. They live on a settlement called Gush Etzion. And Ori has a secret, and the secret is related to Salem Abu Khdir. And at this point in the novel, Salem has died, and that death is putting a lot of pressure on a lot of these stories in ways that maybe the characters are and aren't aware of. But there's a kind of pressure being put on, and in his own way, Ori feels that. Although he wouldn't say that. His main concern at this point is that he's bored, and tired, and previously, where I'm jumping in the chapter, he's been texting with his mother on guard duty. So 189. Ori kicks another pebble. He checks his watch again. Not even 1 a.m. Kus emek. With him are all the familiar pricklings, boredom edged with exhaustion, and a bleak low-grade horniness that never seems to go away. He's posted inside the closed gate of the base, guarding the big tinny shed that is the armory. He can't see past the gate's camo netting, but knows that outside, the road is badly paved. Really, this is less of a base than an outpost. Not even a real mess hall. Just some big pots to boil pasta. Night air cools his cheeks and neck, but he can't reach under his vest, packed heavy with extra clips and stun grenades, rubber tubing, and unexplained stray bullets he doesn't know what to do with, a notebook and a dead pen. His right hand secures his tavor, a rifle, in a gesture so ingrained he doesn't know he is doing it. Here is a typical army atrocity. The armory is empty. Empty. It's locked and guarded and completely empty. Under the pus yellow light of the empty armory, his shadow is long. It wouldn't be so bad if there were someone else with him, but everyone is either asleep or out on patrol. So as this chapter progresses, Ori is, he will admit he's not supposed to be on his phone when he's on guard duty, but he's on his phone and he's texting with a few people, but most consistently his mother, mainly because she's the only one who consistently answers his texts. I think that this is something that sort of continues to shock me about life in Israel for Israelis, where army life doesn't really sort of like interrupt people's routines or youths, but just kind of patterns it, and how normal and familiar it can feel to the people in it. So. Ori is startled at a low grumble behind him. He spins around to see a border police jeep. The sound is the crunch of slow tires on gravel, coming at him from the heart of the base. I'm on page 194. Headlights killed. He can't see into the windshield, protected as it is, with metal grating against stone throwers, a grill like barred teeth. From here, under the uncertain light of the armory, the jeep looks like a dark mouth approaching him. Ahlan, he waves, but the vehicle curves by him, not stopping. Inside, he can just make out the figures in the passenger seat. It's nobody in his unit. It must be one of the guys from the intelligence team that also uses this base. Cherries, they are called. They specialize in disguising themselves as Arabs. The cherry in the jeep does not wave, nor does the jeep stop. It disappears behind the trailers where soon, but not soon enough, Ori will be asleep. Maybe they are doing some kind of surveillance. Not even his commander knows much about the cherries or where their orders come from. They lean against the back of trailers, smoking, growing quiet when anyone approaches. Maybe the weirdest part is that they don't wear a uniform. The cherries dress like civilians, jeans and t-shirts. Either they're never in uniform or they're always in uniform. It depends how you look at it. Ori is not exactly scared of them, but it's weird how much the cherries look like Arabs, talk like Arabs. They cover their faces and join in on the wrong side of demonstrations or a mob of stone throwers, and then it's so crazy to see. They are on either side of an Arab, a real one, before he can even throw the stone, lifting him, pushing his head down. The guy never gets it at first, like, who are you? Who's your father? The Arabs can't believe there were Jews among them, looking like them, speaking Arabic like them the whole time. Ori has watched this at demonstrations when they're shooting tear gas and sound bombs and arc arcs over crowds of villagers who wave olive branches, scurry like bugs, duck from the sound of it. But the Palestinians aren't really scared of flashbang or even a little live fire. It's cherries who really freak them out, who cause a panic to rise up. Ori thinks the Arabic word for the chaos sounds cool, fawda. It's a word that sounds like what it is, fawda. So I'm going to jump again ahead. This, the chapter continues, and the cherries in the Jeep circle by several more times. Ori growing sort of increasingly curious and a little uneasy about it. In Arabic, the unit is called duvdanim, by the way, in case anyone's maybe wondering. They do seem to be the objects of a kind of reverent, uncomfortable fascination by a lot of Israelis. Okay, so so I'm going to jump back in. So at this point, the Jeep with the cherries, after circling several times, has pulled back again. And one of the cherries has gotten out of the Jeep and is having a conversation with Ori. And Ori is really having a trouble getting a beat on this guy. At this point, it's about 2 a.m. And it's just the two of them and then the idling Jeep. And they're sort of in the headlights of the Jeep when this exchange goes down on page 206. In the army, there are real Arabs, Bedouin tracking units, Druze warriors up north, all honor and carnage. When one of them speaks Hebrew, you can hear that they are Arab. You can hear the throaty gargle of Arabic haunting all the words. But the cherry sounds normal. He sounds like Ori. Ori is about to ask his name. He wants to know if it's an Arab name or a Jewish name, but somehow he knows that the cherry won't answer him. The way the cherry smokes, he inhales before he's done exhaling. The smoke leaks out of his nose. Or maybe he would answer Ori. Maybe he would answer and say, "My name is Salam Abu something." Ori wasn't there. Ori didn't see. He feels like he's saying this to the cherry, like he's being interrogated. "Shut up. Where are you from?" Ori asks, just to say something aloud. "The north." The cherry is facing the Jeep. "Like a village?" The cherry turns to Ori. "Are you trying to find out if I'm Arab?" "No," Ori says. Pause. The cherry doesn't look away. "Yes," Ori says. The cherry moves his tongue around in his mouth, like he's looking for something there. "I'm a Jew." Pause. Brother of mine." Ach shali. Ori keeps talking like an idiot. "Why do you speak Arabic so well?" "When did you hear me speak Arabic?" "When did he?" "But you do. I mean, Yanni, you can." He's talking fast, Ori is, talking like he can talk his way out of what comes next. But what comes next? The cherry laughs. "Yanni," he repeats. "Why do you speak Hebrew so well?" But he doesn't wait for an answer, shrugs with an agitation that feels familiar to Ori. The cherry says, "You want me to speak Arabic?" It's not a question. He yells something in Arabic in the direction of the Jeep. Ori hears the word Jaish, army. The sound of the foreign language creeps along Ori's shoulders like spiders down into his ear. Arabic. And suddenly Ori knows that he is wrong. He was wrong. These are not cherries. These are Arabs. These are Palestinians from some Hamas village. The Arab is going to stuff Ori in this stolen Jeep and drive him into the night through the gates that Ori, yes, Ori himself will open for them when they force him to. The Arab turns to Ori, smiling, says something fast, but Ori is sure, he is so sure he catches the word Salam, the dead boy. They have come for revenge. Finally, it's happening. I think so. I'll stop there.
Wow, that really brought the novel back to me so powerfully. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Yeah,
We have several questions from the audience. I'm going to share Ted Fowler's question first because it kind of relates to some of the language stuff that you just did in
sure.
that last passage. He asks, he says, many Hebrew and Arabic words appear in the novel unglossed, and the readers absorb them by understanding the context. What was the process of adding or deleting such words, including how did your editor respond to the multilingualism of this project? And maybe you'd also comment a little bit on your own language journey.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ted. Such a great question. Um, yes, so um, unglossed was important to me. I'll start there, which I'm taking to mean not italicized, not essentially remarked upon, um, which was important to me in general to, let's say, I really wanted to think a lot about how I was negotiating between being true to the interiority of the character whose point of view I was in and making this book legible to a reader, making it an actual act of communication. So these were sort of my two concerns. And I thought a lot about the italics, and where I fell was influenced by one of my classmates at UCI, Jaime Lalinde, who has given the issue of sort of writing um, including languages other than English in your stories, let's say, and communities that are not English speaking in your stories. And I think we had a lot of discussions, and they were very illuminating to me, I will say. But ultimately, what I decided was that the italics felt like they would pull you too far out of the character, and you would suddenly be so aware of me, the writer, communicating with you, the reader, instead of what I wanted to foster, which was a kind of intimacy between the character and the reader, and kind of leave myself out of it or make myself not detectable, let's say. And so I would say I erred on I had more Arabic and Hebrew in initial drafts, and I would kind of pull back and I would ask myself, what it was serving, who it was serving, if it was necessary. By the time it got to my editor, I mean, I would say I was my editor, Terry Carton at HarperCollins, was so different to me on any matter related to, I would say, decisions I would largely call sort of like cultural. Um, and so I didn't. There was a few copy editors who wanted to italicize it, and I would sort of just, my favorite word, new word, was stet. Let it stand, which means no, I do not accept your edit. But it wasn't a fight, and it wasn't contentious. But I did have to. One of the interesting challenges was to find ways to tacitly inform a reader of a word's definition without explicitly giving it to them. I myself studied Hebrew and Arabic for years. And so I wasn't always, I had to sometimes really remind myself that the kind of the fabric of the world and the language of the world that I really was living in and swimming in was pretty incomprehensible to the readers I was imagining. So it was a kind of constant negotiation. Uh, yeah, I hope. Yeah, thank you for the question, Ted.
Great. Anthony Garrett has a comment here. He says, I love this novel. You captured the complex truth of Israel Palestine. Having said that, I keep thinking about who I can recommend it to. Most of the Jews and Arabs I know are gripped by ideological rigidity. Who is your audience? Best of luck. And then he also notes that Jaffa Bookstore doesn't have your book for sale yet.
Yafa Bookstore, I love. So this is someone who must be writing in from Israel. Yafa Bookstore is one of the places I studied colloquial Amiya, like colloquial Arabic. It's a wonderful resource in Jaffa. They don't have it. Well, maybe they'll get it eventually. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I hope that this is the kind of book that, I don't know. I don't. I try not to think about it too much because all I could do was write the book with the most integrity and honesty and heart that I could, and hope that it reached people and that they were willing to open their hearts to it. Um, I've had some very interesting conversations with people who maybe come from a specific ideological point of view. And it's interesting to see how people respond to finding that maybe they can relate to someone who they disagree with ideologically. So I remain hopeful that it'll find its way to people who can receive it. But recommend it to everyone.
Absolutely. This is another question. This is from Frank Prey. And he asks, what was the central question you wanted to explore in the writing of this novel? And when in the process did that question emerge for you?
Wow. I don't know if there was a single question. Definitely there was, probably each chapter has a specific question that I was pursuing, like a pretty specific question. But in terms of the whole novel, maybe ultimately became something like, how can truth hold so many paradoxes that don't seem to cancel each other out? That, how I was studying just before on this call with my chevruta, which is like a study partner for Talmud. And we were talking about what we always end up talking about, which is how Hebrew words like always seem to contain their own opposites. And the word that came up this time was panim, which means face, but also means interior, the most interior, like the deepest interior of a person or a place. And so it's both sort of like the surface and the interior, and kind of put me in a real. I'll probably be thinking about that for the next month. But I think something along the lines of that, some sense that there's multiple competing truths, and how can that be? But it must be, maybe something like that was the question of the novel itself.
Here's another question sort of on the political direction.
Oh, great.
From Andrew Barry. Today, Human Rights Watch released a report accusing Israel of apartheid and persecution. Would such an announcement be significant for characters in City of a Thousand Gates?
If it's the Andrew Barry, I think it is. I think we went to college together. So hi, Andrew. Would it be significant to them? No. No, not in the least. No, I think that I don't think that announcement would affect any character's material reality. I don't think it would change the heart of anyone participating in the occupation, and I don't think it would tell anyone living under it anything they don't know. Sorry. But yeah, no, I don't. No, I don't. Yeah, that's what I think. Like, it feels like those sort of like debates and designations are like so important for people living outside the region. Sorry, that's like my neighbor mowing his lawn. But yeah, I can't see it coming up for the characters in the novel except dismissively. Maybe Samar, the professor, she brings so much thought and depth to everything. Maybe I could see her having something. I love inhabiting her. Maybe I could answer that question with more depth and nuance if I were writing it from her point of view. But my gut answer is no.
Okay, and this is another question from Ted Fowler.
Ted.
He says, if I were to pick just one out of the many phrases in this novel, it would be anyone can find themselves on the so-called wrong side of history. The phrase uttered to someone who's read your novel very carefully, by the way, the phrase uttered by the German journalist Vera, whose name means truth, I guess, comes late in the novel. But how soon did it appear in your thinking about the novel and the direction it would take?
Wow, great question. How soon did it emerge? It does come late in the novel. And, she has her own agenda when she says that, as someone whose grandparents had ties to the Nazi party. Yeah, that emerged for me very soon. I would say, actually, not even in writing the novel. That kind of emerged for me in the nonfiction writing that I had done. Some of it was published, some of it just ended up going sort of into the desk drawer, as you say, or into the recycling. I don't know, but my own sort of understanding of what it meant for me, maybe to build my life as I have done um, in in Israel, and a life I love. I have strong ties to Israel, and I'm an Israeli citizen, and deep important friendships and community there. And yet, my life there is sort of shadowed by an awareness of all the lives that are erased by me having a life there. And I think that understanding almost necessitated the writing of the novel. Yeah.
Well, that takes us to almost 6 o'clock, and it's kind of a beautiful place to end. We have a lot of great people in the audience. Many of them share your last name. So thank you, Sachs family, for coming. But we also have faculty and current and alums of our graduate programs and lots of other wonderful people here. And so I want to thank everybody who has come. You can see more Illuminations events on our website, illuminationsuci.edu. So it's really great to have you all here. And of course, it's wonderful to have Rebecca Sachs here. We shared so much when she was in residence here at UCI. And so it is really just such a privilege and a pleasure to congratulate her, Mazel Tov, on your book. And we look forward to the next book.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's so a pleasure. It's such a pleasure to be back. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody.